May 4, 1945, Czechoslovakia, rail yard east of Pilsen. 300 men stood in formation across the rail yard's northern platform. Dawn had broken 40 minutes earlier. The air was still and cool. Rifles were held at port arms. Machine gun crews stood beside their weapons, which rested on tripods facing south across the tracks. Ammunition belts hung ready. Every man wore full field equipment. No one moved. Across the yard, 200 meters distant, another formation occupied the southern platform. Different uniforms, different weapons, same readiness, same silence. The space between the two groups was empty except for rail tracks, gravel, and the skeletal frames of bombed freight cars. A colonel stood at the front of the northern formation. His hands were at his sides. His cap was square on his head. He faced the opposite platform but made no gesture. Behind him, 300 men waited. Their eyes moved between the colonel and the distant formation. Fingers rested near triggers. Breathing was shallow and controlled. Nothing had been said for 11 minutes. The command to prepare had been given at 05:47 hours. Since then, silence. The formations faced each other. The distance between them was clear, the sight lines unobstructed. Everything was ready. Nothing happened. The northern formation consisted of elements from the U.S. 16th Armored Division, which had entered Pilsen 2 days earlier as German forces withdrew westward ahead of Soviet advances. The unit had secured the rail yard on May 3 after brief skirmishing with retreating Wehrmacht troops. The area was strategically significant. 4 main rail lines converged here, connecting western Bohemia to Germany, Austria, and points east. The southern formation was composed of Soviet infantry from the 13th Guards Rifle Division, which had entered the city from the east during the night. Their arrival had been unanticipated by American command. Intelligence reports had placed Soviet forward elements at least 50 kilometers away. The unexpected presence created immediate complications regarding territorial control and operational jurisdiction. The rail yard itself was partially destroyed. Allied bombing raids in March had collapsed 2 sheds and left craters across the switching area. Repair crews had restored limited function to 3 main lines, but debris remained scattered throughout the complex. Visibility across the yard was excellent. Cover was minimal. The platform stood elevated above the tracks, providing clear fields of fire in all directions. Weather was neutral. No rain, no fog. Temperature hovering just above freezing. Wind negligible. The sun rose behind the American position, placing the Soviet formation in shadow. This provided marginal advantage in terms of visibility, but also meant American soldiers were backlit and more easily observed. Both formations had occupied their positions at approximately the same time, around 05:30 hours, following a tense encounter between advance patrols an hour earlier. No shots had been exchanged during that encounter, but weapons had been raised, and voices had been raised louder. Officers from both sides had withdrawn to consult with their commands. Then the formations had assembled. Orders had been given to prepare for engagement, and now both groups stood, armed and facing each other, waiting. American doctrine for this type of confrontation emphasized demonstration of force combined with clear communication of intent. Units were trained to establish defensive positions, display readiness, and maintain discipline while command-level negotiations proceeded. However, doctrine also required preparation for immediate engagement if fired upon, or if withdrawal was not feasible. The colonel commanding the American formation, his name recorded in unit logs as Lieutenant Colonel Martin Decker, had conducted briefings on Soviet capabilities during the advance through Germany. His men understood that Soviet infantry tactics prioritized massed fire, rapid assault, and overwhelming local superiority. At this range, with prepared positions on both sides, an exchange of fire would result in significant casualties within the first 60 seconds. Machine gun crews had ranged their weapons. The MG-42s captured from German units and the American M1919 Brownings were sighted on the opposite platform. Interlocking fields of fire had been established. Riflemen had selected individual targets, a standard practice intended to maximize initial volley effectiveness. Grenadiers stood ready with M1 carbines and fragmentation grenades, though the range made grenades largely irrelevant. Soviet formations across the yard displayed similar preparation. Their weapons were visible: PPSH submachine guns, Mosin-Nagant rifles, DP-28 light machine guns mounted on bipods. Officers carried TT-33 pistols in holsters. The formation was dense, tighter spacing than American doctrine would permit, but disciplined. No one broke ranks. No one advanced. Standard engagement protocol required clear rules of engagement and authorization from battalion level or higher. Decker had received orders to hold the rail yard and prevent unauthorized access. Those orders had been issued 36 hours earlier when the threat was German, not Soviet. The current situation fell outside anticipated scenarios. Communication with division headquarters was intermittent due to damaged telephone lines. Radio contact was possible but unreliable. Decker had requested guidance at 05:52 hours. No response had been received. The expectation among the men was clear. Someone would fire first, or someone would order withdrawal. The middle ground, standing indefinitely in armed confrontation, was tactically unstable and psychologically exhausting. At 06:14 hours, a Soviet officer stepped forward from the southern formation. He stopped after 3 paces. He stood alone between his men and the empty rail yard. His posture was formal. His weapon remained holstered. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stood exposed, equidistant between the two armed groups. Decker did not respond. The American formation did not move. Machine gunners kept their hands on their weapons but did not shift aim. Riflemen maintained their positions. Eyes tracked the Soviet officer, but no one raised a weapon to firing position. No one called out. No challenge was issued. The Soviet officer remained standing. 10 seconds passed. 20. He did not advance further. He did not retreat. The space around him was enormous and empty. His visibility to both formations was complete. He was within range of every weapon on the northern platform. Decker's hands remained at his sides. No order was given. No whistle blown. No signal passed down the line. The American formation held its ground. The Soviet formation, observing this, also held. The officer stood alone in the center of the yard. The silence deepened. The moment stretched. Nothing broke. Time became difficult to measure. Men experienced the wait as both endless and compressed. Muscles tensed for action found no release. Adrenaline prepared bodies for movement that did not occur. The physiological cost of sustained readiness began accumulating. Trembling hands, dry mouths, accelerated heart rates that eventually exhausted themselves into heavy, slow thuds. The Soviet officer remained in position. His stillness communicated something, but interpretation varied among the American soldiers. Some read it as a challenge. Others saw a gesture of non-aggression. A few interpreted it as deliberate provocation designed to test American resolve. The ambiguity itself became a form of tension. Not knowing what the action meant made responding to it impossible. Decker consulted briefly with his executive officer, a captain named Reese, whose subsequent report described the conversation as minimal and procedural. No decisions were articulated. No change in posture was ordered. The consultation ended, and both officers returned to their positions. The formation remained static. Behind the American line, a radio operator received a fragmented transmission. Static obscured most of the content. The words "hold position" were audible. Also, await and possibly coordination. The operator relayed this to Decker, who nodded once but issued no further instructions. The incomplete message clarified nothing. It only confirmed that higher command was aware of the situation and had not ordered withdrawal. Whether engagement was authorized remained unclear. At 06:31, the Soviet officer turned and walked back to his formation. His pace was measured. He did not hurry. He rejoined his line and resumed his position among the other officers. The space in the center of the rail yard became empty again. Both formations continued facing each other. The direct confrontation had ended, but the standoff remained. No resolution had been achieved. The situation simply continued in a new configuration. Two armed groups, 200 meters apart, without clear purpose or direction. Men shifted weight from foot to foot. Some lowered their rifles slightly, easing the strain on their arms. Others maintained strict readiness. The lack of uniformity in posture reflected the lack of clarity in the situation. Discipline held. No one broke ranks or spoke, but the cohesion that comes from shared understanding had frayed. Decker later described his reasoning in a written statement dated May 7, 1945, submitted to division headquarters as part of a routine operational report. He noted that engagement with Soviet forces would constitute a violation of standing orders prohibiting conflict with Allied armies. He observed that the rail yard held limited tactical value if its seizure resulted in a breakdown of inter-Allied coordination. He stated that the Soviet formation had not demonstrated hostile intent beyond occupying a position that American forces also occupied. More fundamentally, Decker assessed that the strategic situation had shifted. Germany's surrender was imminent. Rumors had circulated for days that capitulation was being negotiated. The war in Europe was effectively over. Initiating combat with a nominal ally over control of a rail yard in Czechoslovakia made no operational sense. The risk was catastrophic. The gain was symbolic at best. Additionally, the Soviet officers' forward movement had been, in Decker's assessment, a test, not of American willingness to fight, but of American willingness to avoid fighting. By stepping into the open unarmed, the officer had created a scenario where firing first would appear as aggression rather than defense. Decker recognized this and chose not to respond. His stillness mirrored the Soviet officer's stillness. Both were forms of communication conducted without words. The absence of clear orders from division headquarters also factored into the decision. Without explicit authorization to engage or explicit orders to withdraw, Decker defaulted to the least irreversible option: maintain position, maintain readiness, but do not initiate contact. This preserved flexibility while avoiding escalation. It was a command decision made in the absence of command guidance, a choice that appeared as inaction but was, in fact, deliberate restraint. The men understood none of this in detail. They knew only that they had not been ordered to fire and therefore they did not fire. The doctrine of obedience to orders held. The absence of an order to act became, functionally, an order not to act. At 07:18 hours, a staff car arrived at the northern edge of the rail yard. A major emerged carrying documents. He approached Decker and spoke briefly. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Decker then turned to the formation and gave a single command: stand down. The men lowered their weapons. Machine gun crews disassembled their positions. Ammunition belts were stowed. The formation dissolved into smaller groups that dispersed toward the northern exit of the yard. Movement was orderly but not hurried. Relief was visible in posture, shoulders relaxed, grips loosened, but no one spoke loudly or celebrated. The release of tension was quiet and individual. Across the yard, the Soviet formation also stood down. The sequence was similar: orders given, weapons lowered, groups dispersing. Both units withdrew from the platform simultaneously, as though choreographed, though no coordination had occurred. The symmetry was coincidental but complete. By 07:45, the rail yard was empty except for sentries posted at perimeter positions by both forces. The Americans occupied the western approaches. The Soviets controlled the eastern side. A tacit division of the facility had been established without negotiation or formal agreement. Patrols from both sides would encounter each other over the following days, but no further confrontations occurred. The rail yard returned to a state of suspended function. Trains did not run. Repair work ceased. The facility became a no-man's land between two armies that had stopped advancing. It remained in this state until Soviet administrative control was formalized weeks later under agreements reached at higher command levels. Decker's unit moved west on May 5, reassigned to occupation duties in Germany. They departed Pilsen without ceremony. The rail yard and its brief moment of armed confrontation receded immediately into the background of larger events. No official report of the confrontation was filed beyond Decker's brief operational summary, which described the event as temporary positioning overlap resolved through command coordination. No casualties were reported because none occurred. No engagement was documented because no shots were fired. The incident appeared in no after-action reviews and was mentioned in no unit histories compiled in subsequent years. Division headquarters archives contain a single reference, a radio log entry timestamped 06, 54 hours noting potential contact with Soviet forces, Pilsen rail yard, situation under observation. The entry is followed by another at 07, 22 hours, Pilsen situation resolved, no action required. The gap between these entries contains no detail. What occurred during that half hour is absent from the record. Soviet archives, examined decades later by historians researching the end of the European War, contain no mention of the rail yard confrontation. Daily reports from the 13th Guards Rifle Division for May 4 note arrival in Pilsen and establishment of security positions. No unusual incidents are recorded. The meeting of forces is either omitted as insignificant or was never reported upward through the Soviet command structure. Participants did not discuss the event in detail in post-war years. Interviews conducted with veterans of the 16th Armored Division occasionally reference tense moments with the Russians, but provide no specifics. The incident lacked the dramatic structure that makes stories memorable. No shots fired, no casualties, no clear resolution. It simply happened and then ended. Memory requires narrative shape. This event had none. The silence is structural. Violence generates documentation. Its absence generates nothing. The rail yard confrontation exists in records only as a gap, a moment when something could have occurred but did not, leaving no trace except the absence itself. Lieutenant Colonel Decker returned to the United States in November 1945. He remained in the Army and served during the Korean War, retiring in 1958 with the rank of full colonel. His service record notes commendations for leadership in Germany, but makes no specific reference to the Pilsen incident. He died in 1979. His family donated his papers to a military archive, but the collection contains no diary entries or personal reflections on May 4, 1945. The Captain Reese left the service in 1946 and worked in civil engineering. He responded to a Veterans Association questionnaire in 1982, describing his time in Europe as mostly uneventful after combat ceased. He did not mention the rail yard. He died in 1991. Several enlisted men from the formation were interviewed during the 1990s as part of oral history projects documenting the final days of World War II in Europe. One mentioned standing in formation, somewhere in Czechoslovakia, and waiting for something that didn't happen. He could not recall the date or location with precision. Another remembered Russians on the other side of some train tracks, but provided no additional context. Memory had blurred the incident into the general background of occupation duties. The Soviet officer who stepped forward was never identified. His name does not appear in accessible records. Whether he survived the post-war period, whether he remained in the military, whether he ever spoke of the moment, these questions have no answers. The rail yard continued operating under Soviet and later Czech administration until the 1990s. It was partially modernized, then gradually fell into disuse as rail traffic patterns shifted. Parts of the facility remain, though much has been demolished or repurposed. No marker indicates that armies once faced each other there. The platforms are gone. The tracks have been reconfigured. The site is unrecognizable. May 4, 1945, was 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. The war was ending in fragments, some units still fighting, others already disarmed, many simply waiting for official word that allowed them to stop. Pilsen was one of hundreds of locations where the end arrived quietly, without climax, as armed men stood facing each other and chose not to act. The command that froze 300 soldiers in place was, ultimately, no command at all. It was the absence of an order to fire. That absence held for 1 hour and 31 minutes. Then it dissolved as both sides withdrew and the rail yard returned to emptiness. No treaty was signed there. No principle was established. The moment simply passed. 300 men stood ready. Weapons were prepared. Distance was measured. Targets were identified. Everything necessary for violence was present. The command to execute was not given, and so nothing happened. The formation dispersed. The men moved on. The record stayed blank. What did not occur left no monument and required no explanation. The war ended days later. The rail yard changed hands through administrative process. The soldiers returned home or moved to new assignments. The moment when they stood frozen in place, waiting for an order that never came, faded into the vast category of things that almost happened but did not, and which therefore occupy no space in history except as silence, complete, unremarkable, and final.